Ladies and gentlemen, this is Professor Hamamoto. Welcome. It is February 2nd, year 2022, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I am joined today with an incredible, he's prolific and profound author. Many of you already know him. His name is Michael A. Hoffman II. You probably are most familiar with his book, this classic book, probably one of the more plagiarized manuscripts, books out there. It's titled Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, that was published back in 2001. Today, we're going to be speaking about his newest book. I believe it's his latest offering. It's called Twilight Language. By the way, that's one of the phrases that Michael Hoffman has put into the vocabulary of people who did this type of work, or at least they think they do, because this book is very, very heavy. And I'm not going to go through his entire publication resume. I'll just show you the ones that I have on hand right now. This one here, and of course, Michael, if you want to, you can touch on it, but I'm reading it very carefully. Adolf Hitler, Enemy of the German People. And then I have this text. It's a doorstop. It runs over 600 pages. It's titled The Talmud Tested. And in this particular, it's a reprint, but Michael writes an incredible introduction and bibliography for this book here. So you can just by of course, and we're going to end up hopefully with, and I missed this when I was looking at his site on Amazon. Yes, I admit it, I buy books from Amazon. But he has published a book called Chipangu, Golden Chipangu, if I'm pronouncing. I think that's either the Italian or ancient Chinese name for what we know as Japan. And I'm very interested in that because most of this research is almost exclusively Atlantic focused, Mediterranean focused, Western European, Central, but there's very, very little that talks about the other part of the world. And I was surprised and pleased really that Michael Hoffman has done a lot of work in this area. And there's another side of Michael Hoffman that I didn't know about, and that he has an interest in nutrition, issues of diet and nutrition. And for his readers and his audience, I think this might be a new insight into his work and the span of his interest. Michael A. Hoffman II, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Daryl, and for that very kind introduction.
Yes, can I start with some biographical information? In your most recent book, which is Twilight Language, you have, I think the very first photograph is that of Shelby Downard. Now, I have one or two of his books. Now, what was your relationship with Shelby Downard?
Well, he was basically my mentor in the areas of Twilight Language and secret societies, though I had interest in that from a very young age, not too far Serling of Twilight Zone fame, where he kept his summer cottage. And I actually ran into him over the years at the Huron Park at Redland. I met with him at the State University of New York at Oswego and spent about 2 hours with him. Very interesting fellow. And so from there, we went to a man by the name of William N. Grimstad, or Bill Grimstad, writes sometimes under the name of Jim Brandon. And it was Mr. Grimstad who's largely responsible for introducing James Shelby Downard to the public and to me personally. And I met with Shelby in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was a traveling man, and he would be in the desert Southwest quite often, which he knew as well as we know the back of our hand, sometimes in St. Petersburg, mostly in the deep South or the Southwest. And he was really the pioneer in terms of what he called onomatology, the study of the science of words, as well as mystical toponymy, which is to see the earth as a grid originating with the Royal Academy and Royal Sciences of the monarchs of England in terms of laying out the lines of latitude and longitude, and then looking at the numerological significance, the possibility of that, which fascinated me, as you can well imagine, particularly when he pointed out all of the anomalous happenings that had occurred along the 32nd and 33rd degree lines of north parallel latitude. And that's where we have the creation and destruction of primordial matter at the Trinity site in New Mexico. The nickname of New Mexico is the land of enchantment. And that bomb went off, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, at the head of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a forlorn road in Mexican legend and lore, although it's, of course, a real road. And from there, we move east to Dallas, Texas, Dealey Plaza, the site of the first Masonic temple in Dallas, near the 33rd degree line where President Kennedy had his appointment with destiny. And also the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry Southern Jurisdiction, reputed to be the most powerful in the world, is located on the 33rd degree line in Carolina. So this was an expansion of my own consciousness in terms of looking at aspects of so-called conspiracy theory, radical historiography, in ways that others had not. James Shelby Downard was a real pioneer, and he and I stayed friends and stayed in touch from 1975, when I first met him, all the way to his death in 1998. And he certainly enlightened me and made my life much brighter and more lucid in many ways. And so Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare was a product of that. But also I had been a reporter for the New York Bureau of the Associated Press. And in the course of my journalistic career, I investigated the double initial murders of young girls in Rochester, New York, as well as the Son of Sam killings in New York City. And then one of the last cases that I investigated right on site was the Unabomber, so-called Ted Kaczynski in Lincoln and Helena, Montana, where I was. And Mr. Downard, as old as he was, and he was in his late 80s, he was so fascinated by the Unabomber case, he actually wanted to travel out there, but he was getting fairly ill with an illness, with a cancer that would eventually kill him. But he was very enthusiastic about my research, because he felt, as you noticed from the Twilight Language book where I mentioned Kaczynski, he was very sensitive to notions of scapegoating and people who have been targeted by the cryptocracy, as we call it, as a scapegoat. And Kaczynski, we felt, fit that template very well. So from there, I covered a trial in Toronto, Canada, where my first book was written, The Great Holocaust Trial, about the Inquisition of Ernst Zundel, a German-Canadian who had questions about the World War II official Allied liturgy, as I continue to do, and particularly in the case of Japan, where we have Holocausts not only at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also in Tokyo itself. Actually, in some ways, apart from the phenomenon of the nuclear bomb and the aura of nuclear energy, which makes the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Holocaust so iridescent, you could say, is the bombing of Tokyo, the wooden city, Edo, which was set on fire. And it has been stated by the US Air Force survey itself that those 6 hours of turning civilian human flesh into a barbecue pit was the greatest loss of life in the history of humanity. And that comes from the United States government. I have it on my website, and I could provide you a link by email. So, however, the word Holocaust doesn't get to be conferred upon those burnings, because there's a proprietary relationship that's been established between one, persecution and destruction of people, the tragic and criminal destruction of Judaic people in the German-controlled centers of Europe. However, other Holocausts are excluded, and I find that chauvinistic and possibly even highly racist when one thinks about that. And finally, and I'll turn it back to you, I was deeply influenced by coming across the macrobiotic, not only diet, but way of life, founded by George Osawa, who was of samurai heritage, a very sickly boy. In fact, he tells a story that his mother almost threw him into a river when he was 4 years old to just extinguish his life. He was so weak and sickly. And he began to observe a Japanese veterinarian and how he had success with horses. in terms of his methodology. And that might seem somewhat strange, but Osawa himself was a creature of paradox. He was described by many of his followers as half saint and half gangster, a very unusual guy, and it's difficult not to be attracted to him. He was an ambassador for the Japanese government, informally, de facto, in the late 1930s, and he warned the Tojo government against going to war against the United States. He was actually jailed for a while because of the peace feelers he had sent out to China. And then he landed on his feet in the United States after a brief sojourn in France prior to the onset of World War II. And he had two, in particular, there were many others, but two followers in particular, and he gave them these names: Herman Aihara, his actual name is a Japanese name, but Herman and Cornelia Aihara in the West Coast, and Michio and Evelyn Cushy on the East Coast. And they largely popularized the macrobiotics afterwards. And what I would say, what I learned from them is not only that the West tends to render things over complex, and we tend to reject that which is simple, because unless a PhD or an MD or a scientist or some credentialed person presents us with a complex schema of whatever it is we're studying, then we say, well, okay, that's what we need in order to process this and approach comprehension. Whereas, and the word Zen has been overused certainly, but in the Zen-like radiance of that laser beam, which these particular Japanese brought to my own meditation and cognition, was the concept that there are simple facts and data, and they don't need a great deal of embroidery for us to understand it. And the other thing is that Mr. Osawa, Sensei Osawa, always said, bite off more than you can chew, take on more than you think that you can handle. And I have a large family, and I was concerned after living in Southern California that they were not going to have access to nature and life. And I came across an 80-acre farm that was unbelievably cheap in upstate New York in the early 90s. And I was frightened about doing it, because I'm not really a farmer at that time. I didn't have the skills farmers need in terms of mechanics and carpentry. And yet Mr. Osawa's words echoed in my head, bite off more than you can chew. And we bought that farm, and our children had some glorious years there. So I'm very grateful to him. He taught gratitude. In fact, there should be a photo of George Osawa in every natural food store in America, because macrobiotics in its early days is what weaned the American health food people away from their vitamins. Basically, health food stores in the 60s were vitamin pill stores. Whole grains were sort of a side issue. And Osawa and macrobiotics changed that significantly. Unfortunately, there's very little footprint today. I think that some of the Americans who were leaders in the movement have let that movement down, but I'm sure there are a number of issues, and I'm not privy to all of them, for why it's been not quite extinguished. But I'm told there's only a couple of macrobiotic restaurants in America remaining. However, Osawa and Kushi and Aihara always said, if you can't find a macrobiotic restaurant, go to an ethnic restaurant, which is faithful to the original peasant kind of cuisine. They always thought that peasant cuisine was the most healthful. So I'll visit almost any good Asian restaurant when I'm in a city where I need to eat, and also the Mediterranean diet and so forth. But it's had quite an impact on me, and I'm very grateful to those people and how much they sacrificed to bring the macrobiotic or big life view to America and Americans, and Europe as well.
Well, that's an incredible introduction, and I myself, inspired by your example, will be checking into the life of George Osawa, and I guess the Aihara people as well, who were in Los Angeles. They're not very well known within the Japanese American community. Of course, that was intentional, because they were interned. They were in concentration camp to break that continuity, not just of the population, but of the knowledge exchange.
Yes, and this is this. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Professor, but
oh yeah, I have that. I have that book.
Yeah, the fact that it actually uses the word in terms of the internment of Japanese Americans, America's concentration camps. Most people shy away from that. Yes, and here I have just very briefly for your listeners, this is probably the very best book. It hasn't been reprinted. It should be reprinted by Dr. Koch, Macrobiotics Yesterday and Today. Tremendous insight into George Osawa and highly recommended.
Excellent. I'll try to find it on the used market. And I did have my Australian bone broth with some natto inside there fermented. So that's my typical breakfast. So Sensei Osawa, your influence somehow, even without knowing your work, has been handed down. Now, it's really incredible. I mean, you have this interest in Chan or Zen philosophy. And ladies and gentlemen, put Allen Ginsberg and all the Beat movement out of your mind for a moment. And as you hear me speak, put Mr. Miyagi out of your mind, because that's all Hollywood garbage in order to include or occult a whole tradition, a whole philosophical, a whole martial, a whole cultural tradition that has been seen as an existential, as the term goes today, an existential threat to the world. Now we're seeing it being placed on China. But what interests me, amongst many areas of interest, Michael or Mr. Hoffman, is that you have that experience with Zen, right? Illumination, as opposed to this elaborate continental philosophical tradition. Even as you name check George Osawa in the beginning here, you're talking about Martin Heidegger and people like Guy Debord. I mean, I don't really see that thinkers on that level or from these areas being discussed seriously and independent research, quote unquote conspiracy research. That alone is intriguing to me. Now, what were you going to SUNY? Were you a philosophy student? How did you get in touch with these thinkers?
Political science. Michael Eisenhower was the philosophy professor there. I did take his class, and that class was in existential philosophy. So it's perceptive of you to have picked up on that. And then I had a Palestinian professor. For whatever reason, he described himself as a Jordanian, but years later, I ran his name past Palestinians, and they said, oh, no, that's a Palestinian name, Faiz Abu Jaber. His niece, Dina or Diana, I don't mean to disrespect her by forgetting the exact pronunciation. She's a consequential novelist, and she sometimes talks about her uncle. He was an amazing man, my political science professor, and he knew that I had an interest. I was 19, 20 years old. He knew I had an interest in history and research. And he said, and I was talking about European matters and things like that. And he said, why don't you look in your own backyard? Because I'm a native of upstate New York on the 42nd degree of north parallel latitude, which I talk about, the so-called psychic highway or burned over district, which historians use those words for where I was born and raised. He said, why don't you look in your own backyard, which is a good place to begin for any budding historian. And sure enough, he had written, what a coincidence or synchronicity, he had written a study of William Morgan, who was the former Freemason who had written a book divulging the first 3 degrees of Masonry. The printing plant where the book was printed was assaulted by mobs of Masons, and Morgan was kidnapped from the Canandaigua, New York jail and drowned in the Niagara River. And this created the first consequential large anti-Masonic movement in the West, beginning in the Northeast. And many of the early leaders of that movement would go on to be figures in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet or associated with him, such as Thurlow Weed, who was a kind of informal ambassador for Lincoln to Europe, as well as his very important Secretary of State, William Seward, who won first elective office as a member of the anti-Masonic Party, which was a formal party, which has the distinction of forming the first political convention in America. They nominated William Wirt, who was Attorney General. But anyhow, Faiz Abu Jaber pointed me in that direction, and that also became a leading interest for me in terms of the anti-Masonic movement in America, Freemasonry in general, and then also involvement of figures like Edgar Allan Poe, who I think are mistaught in high schools and colleges, where people are introduced to the Telltale Heart, which is a good enough story, and the Pit and the Pendulum, but rarely confronting Poe as an anti-Mason, a philosopher in his essay Eureka, but also in the Cask of Amontillado, which is a favorite of mine and which is really about revenge against a Freemason. So there's this whole hidden side to American history, which is not being presented to young people, and it's disparaged as conspiracy theory. And I don't think every aspect of it actually falls under that. It's just what has been missed on the radar screens of so many people who have a limited yardstick for measuring these things. Whereas, as another mentor of mine, Charles Hoy Fort, H-O-Y, Charles Hoy Fort, said, you measure a circle beginning anywhere. And that doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist when you have a larger perspective on what reality is, or at least the attempt to apprehend reality. And so that was quite an influence on me. That's where Rod Serling ended up showing up for a time. And also Richard Funk was an influence, Francis J.M. O'Laughlin at Hobart College, where I matriculated, and many other influences that have kept me independent, including my own mom and dad, who were very much upstream swimmers. I said swingers, but I meant swimmers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So Hobart College is was it a Christian liberal arts college? I mean, it sounded like you had such an incredible grounding at the undergraduate level that students these days could not even begin to understand.
Well, it was nominally Episcopalian school when I was there, and very proud of the Episcopalian heritage, as well they should have been. However, they've lost that heritage now, and it's subsumed in just the stream of consciousness that modern secularism or postmodern secularism has imposed on academia. But yes, it was very interesting at the time, even though I clashed with my political science professor at the time, but I had support from others. But you see, back then, you didn't evaluate your professor. You know, I mean, it still blows my mind that students in college evaluate their professors. I mean, that you'd be taking the risk of whether or not you gave them an A or an F that would influence their evaluation. Well, at that time, and this is 1978, we weren't evaluating our professors, but I had a public debate with my political science professor. And, you know, that was understood at the time, all of this fragility surrounding error has no rights, which is basically the concept of the university these days, the federal government and the media, which is anti-American at its core to say that error has no rights. But back then, a professor had to be willing to debate and take people on. Otherwise, he or she wasn't considered worth their salt. Whereas that concept now is the inquisitorial concept from the Renaissance and post-Renaissance Church of Rome, that error has no rights, later on picked up by the Protestant establishment in the form of Samuel Rutherford, who was as much of an inquisitor as the Renaissance popes. And along comes Jefferson and the founding fathers of America, who say, if it doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg, why would I be trying to suppress it? And error did have rights in the early America, or at least the heritage of that, if it was held up as a principle and then violated, in the breach. But in early America, the concept was, who decides what's error? I mean, right now, as we're speaking, Joe Rogan is being called out for misinformation by presenting Dr. Malone, I believe his name is, who's one of the co-formulators of the RNA vaccines. And it's just declared that this is misinformation. The New York Times ran an article today on Rogan without ever discussing what was Malone's research or even mentioning him by name, for fear that people would Google him. And so when we're in a world where certain ideas or information is labeled erroneous, then we have to ask, who's the authority that decides these things? Because there's a significant body of dissident scientists, including medical physicians and others, who are dissenting from the main COVID narrative. And they have a right to be heard. And labeling someone as an error is basically a religious phenomenon and should not be allowed outside of clearly demarcated areas of theology. But I think theology has now moved into current events.
Wow, it's incredible. It seems like it's from hearing you explain it, this very elaborate repressive censorious system that we're all suffering from right now. It seems like a secular realization of papism.
Yes, absolutely. As long as we're aware too about, I think that the papal Inquisition has been given sufficient attention, although not the roots of it, in the late 15th century Gnosticism, which people like Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino and others who are hailed by much of the Enlightenment, that's often blocked out. But what's lost in that is, for example, the enshrinement of Queen Elizabeth I as being someone who was the exact opposite of the papacy in terms of the freedom she allowed her people within the confines of a 16th century mentality. None of that is true. I mean, she was one of the harshest of the repressors, killers of dissidents, mainly dissident Catholics who were called recusants at the time. And this is, again, is lost to history largely. You can find it when you look up people like Edmund Campion, who she tortured to death and was once someone who she greatly admired, but he couldn't find it in his conscience to uphold the suppression of the Tridentine Latin Mass. And for that, he was, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor is called Bloody, even though she burned people to death. But Elizabeth deserves the moniker Bloody because she actually tortured people to death. Drawing and quartering involves, I won't even belabor it for the sake of the sensibilities of your viewers, but a horrible way of dying, and hundreds of Catholics are killed that way by Elizabeth I. So we need to track this inquisitorial mentality, both in papal auspices as well as Protestant ones. And certainly many Protestants were not implicated in this because Elizabeth represented the Anglican Church, and not all, by no means were all Protestants Anglican. And the same is true of many Catholics who have distanced themselves over the centuries from the Inquisition. And I don't believe the Renaissance and post-Renaissance papalism, I believe that that's a break with the early Catholic Church. And I don't believe that this Inquisition or the punishment of heretics was an inevitable part of the church, because I don't believe it existed in the early church.
I see. Now, in my own recent reading, I see that there's an incredible neglect, and you're from upstate New York, but there's a really incredible vacuum so far as knowledge, understanding, and application of the influence of what I refer to as the Dutch diaspora and their occultic traditions that they brought over during the colonial times and their early intercourse with the native peoples as well. And you, being from upstate, the whole Hudson River Valley, in Indian language, it translates the river that flows two ways. And you mentioned the Son of Sam murders. I have a friend and colleague, Manny Grossman, who has become an authority by putting his boots on the ground of the whole milieu of Untermyer Park, which I think he was a Dutch Jew, right? Untermyer, and you've got the Rensselaer and the Van Cortlandt people. Could you speak to that? I don't really see that a lot in your research, but you're from that area. What about the Dutch occultic tradition?
The Dutch occultic tradition, and I know only a bit about it, would be centered more on what was happening in Amsterdam in the 17th century, where you had a large Judaic diaspora dwelling there. And what that inevitably brings with it is the Kabbalah and the Talmud. The Kabbalah is generally said to be not a sacred text of Orthodox Judaism. And by the way, that's all that existed in that time. Any other type of Judaism didn't arise until the Haskalah under Moses Mendelssohn in the late 18th century. And even then it was a sliver of allegiance it managed to gather. Now in America, the majority of Judaic people who are religious are indeed so-called Reform Judaics, which is the liberal wing of it. But anyhow, in this particular epoch, it was exclusively Talmudic, which is to say, or Frum Talmudic, meaning Talmudic observant. And that's what you had in Amsterdam. A very colorful place, many openings for all kinds of thinkers coming in there, including the Anabaptists, the forefathers of the Mennonites. But in particular, in terms of the money power that had arisen in Holland at the time, and I wrote a book called Usury in Christendom, the Mortal Sin That Was and Now Is Not, investigating the history of usury prohibition in the church. And of course, it was completely banned up until the Renaissance, when it was not Calvin. Calvin has the name for being responsible for legalizing it, but it was actually the nominalist school of papalist philosophy at the University of Tübingen, and that's how it came about. Well, it found firm purchase in Holland, and so where you have the money power, you have a willingness to sell out Christianity to the highest bidder, so to speak. And here you'll notice I'm not suggesting that Judaic people were the progenitors of usury, which many Jew haters attempt to propound. Actually, the usury got its entrance into Western civilization as an institution in Italy and Germany through the Catholic usurers, such as the Fugger family, probably the wealthiest people at that time in all of the West. They were Catholic, as well as the Medici and other more notorious Italian banks of that time, the Strozzi and others. They were clever enough to scapegoat the Judaics, who were running much smaller usury operations, which was legal according to their heritage, but not in Christianity. But yet the Medici operation, Fugger's operation, Fugger actually got the revenues from the sale of indulgences. They were keepers of the treasure chests where that loot came in. And so it's really quite a distraction for people to say, Ezra Pound, who I admire in so many ways, but he's guilty of beginning the history of usury with the Bank of England and what was going on in Holland, instead of looking back 150 years. However, he was something of a fan of the Medici and of the kind of troubadour philosophy that he thought the Medici were nurturing. I think he was wrong there, but in many other ways, a very brave man and a wise man in many other ways. So anyhow, yes, in Holland, you had missionaries from Holland going to Britain when Oliver Cromwell's Puritans had control of London and trying to overturn the 13th century proscription against a Judaic population in England through a rabbi known as Manasseh ben Israel. And again, another myth of history, it's claimed that Cromwell did indeed admit them. Many Catholics seize on that as supposedly a liability of Protestantism. Actually, he did not. He attempted it, but he was resisted by the Puritan Parliament and judiciary. And that is a fact of history. And the person who succeeded Cromwell after his son Richard sort of bobbled it was Charles II, the son of the man that Cromwell had executed. And Charles II actually bears responsibility, or bears our congratulations, for bringing into Great Britain a noticeable Judaic population. And then, of course, it extended up until the 19th century when they were fully admitted in terms of citizenship and membership in Parliament. But so that's about the extent of it. I mean, certainly Freemasonry was operating there, but my principal forte and interest has been in England and the Anglo-Saxon world and its impact on America. And that's where I think I could discuss at greater length the role of Freemasonry and the occult. As far as Untermeyer Park goes, it's news to me. And so I thank you for bringing that to my attention, that Untermeyer was of Dutch descent. Certainly that was a sort of a satanic fairy ground there. And this is part of what I talk about in both secret societies and psychological warfare, as well as Twilight language, in terms of the ceremonial process by which these occult control mechanisms are weaponized, whether by the early Rosicrucians, who were the forerunners of Freemasonry, or Masonry itself, or the successors to Masonry, the Ordo Templi Orientis, it's called the OTO. It's an intentional processing, but it's an open air ritual, as Antonina Artaud predicted, that it will come a time when we will have a civic magic, which is undisguised. And that's what's happening right in front of us in terms of Twilight language keywords and these ceremonies. And as someone who was raised Catholic, and I was an altar boy, and I was in the late or early 1960s, and there, so I had a firsthand view of the Tridentine Latin Mass, which Joseph Campbell said was one of the highest art treasures of the Western world. And Campbell, as you know, was very much enamored of the Japanese tea ceremony, for example. And he drew parallels between the intentionality of the tea ceremony and of the Tridentine Latin Mass. Every gesture the priest makes has significance and has to be done, executed well and consciously. There's no falling asleep during the Tridentine Mass. And so as a percipient at that from a very young age, I was conscious of how important ritual is in imprinting the people in the audience, which is what the Tridentine Latin Mass did. If you weren't Catholic before you entered in there and you started going every week and you could read your missal and follow along with the Latin, missal is the prayer book of the Tridentine Latin Mass, it probably wouldn't be too long before you'd be probably a Catholic. And that's the impact it had. So drawing parallels from that, and of course there's the Black Mass, which has been sensationalized in many ways inaccurately so, but the concept of the Black Mass as a reversal of the Tridentine Latin Mass certainly has significance and importance. And that's what I'm seeing I believe that Son of Sam was an occult ritual for imprinting not only the members of the Son of Sam group of criminals, but also America in general. And so it's very interesting how these things happen. And certainly David Berkowitz was by no means alone. There were others involved in that as well. And there was last summer, a video series, documentary series premiered. The first 2 episodes I endorse called Sons of Sam. And people who remain interested in that case should take a peek at that.
Yeah, that's available on Netflix, if I might say so. I am no stock in Netflix. That's incredible. So do you think that the goings on at Untermeyer Park, so-called Sons of Sam or Son of Sam, was it a local phenomenon specific to Yonkers, which of course is of Dutch origin? Again, this goes back to my whole Dutch diaspora concept, which, by the way, they also were trying to get into Chipangu at the same time, but the daimyo warded them off. They said, no, you're not going to go to the Philippines or somewhere else. You're not coming to Japan, which was one of the reasons why Japan was able to retain its sovereignty over the centuries. But do you think that the Son of Sam network, was that a national or even an international cultic network, or was it localized, in your opinion?
It's hard to say in terms of the extent of the new power structure and ruling class. And we can only go so far. Was a very important accountant who was said to be influential or even in leadership capacity there. It's very murky when you're going toward the top of Son of Sam. And this is due to the interference of the New York Police Department and also of the shredding of documents. That we don't have work of going in. For example, the New York Times ran articles in the 1970s on the front page about MK Ultra, the CIA mind control project. And yet somehow documents, virtually all of them, were shredded or so-called lost to history. And MK Ultra involved assassination.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're breaking up here.
Into the killing of Olson and many others.
You mentioned Frank Olson, was it? Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're having some bandwidth problems here. We're back.
The problem was in my end. There's a dropout here with the internet connection.
Oh, I see. Okay. I can edit this part out there, but we can continue. We don't have to talk about Untermeyer Park. We can talk about different dimensions of. In fact, I wanted to spend time on some of the new insights that you've developed between revelation of the method and your notion of twilight language. Twilight language itself, doesn't that come from Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes and no. You're absolutely right in terms of it is a reference to a technical concept of language in the sacred texts of both Hinduism and Buddhism, where there is an alternate meaning or a sub rosa meaning, but that's technically related. To the best of my knowledge, I'm relying on Ajananda Bharati, the German scholar who used to be called Leopold Fischer, in terms of his take on it. And there are many others, but largely Twilight language, it seems to me, in the East is confined. Of course, there probably is another subliminal language, but it's operating under a different name. But Twilight language, and I talk about it in my book very briefly, in the East refers to a textual double meanings. And it does not have, insofar as I've been able to see, a larger context of occult archetypes which are being induced in people's minds through key words. And so that's how I understand Twilight language in the West.
Okay. Now, another phrase that I associate with you, and maybe you can give us the provenance or the history behind it, but the phrase that I attribute to you, and it's been plagiarized incredibly by people who have no business uttering the phrase, in my opinion, is this idea of revelation of the method. Now, what was the genesis of that, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, I'll return to where I was going, if it's okay with you, with Son of Sam, in the sense of we're talking about lost documents and so forth, but I believe that it was intended that the occult aspects of Son of Sam would be revealed almost fully later on. And this comes along with what James Shelby Downard spoke about in terms of freeze thaw, that initially in these occult crimes and murders, the media, with that insufferable sanctimony and pompousness, which they're notorious for, come forth and announce within, say, 24 hours of the arrest of a perpetrator that the case is solved. In other words, the case is closed. And I was a crime reporter for the Associated Press, and I had many contacts with the police. And of course, any competent detective will tell you that the investigation begins for real on the day that the perpetrator is arrested, because then comes the search for accomplices and motives and so forth. Son of Sam, Newsweek magazine published an article just a few days after he was arrested saying, case closed. This was a lone nut. You can't determine that. You can't determine it with Ted Kaczynski, Lee Harvey Oswald, or anyone. And that's become sort of a template of these people who sneer at conspiracy theory and say that, this is ipso facto true. Well, what happens? So they freeze that, and that's officially what they put forth, that it's a lone nut. But later on, that is thawed, as Mr. Downard said. And then they themselves release the alternative information, like, for example, Sons of Sam. I'm not saying that the producers of Sons of Sam are involved in a conspiracy, but I think that the fact that they were able to have access to certain aspects of the case many decades later indicates that the cryptocracy was not entirely uneasy about this. It may have actually been part of the revelation of the method. Now, the revelation of the method is part of a larger epistemology that James Shelby Downard related to medieval manuscripts called must be, in terms of its inevitability. And that is that we're now in an era where people are so heavily processed, they've been put through the psychic pressure cooker, that they themselves cannot react in a healthy manner when it is revealed to them what their leaders and their trusted officials have done to them. And therefore, when a revelation about high political crime and other forms of crime is revealed to a population, and the population doesn't react in a dynamic way to take charge of this, to bring the criminals to justice in terms of prosecution and jury trials and so forth, then the people are doubly enslaved. So that the secrets keeping of the Masonic societies and others, of these esoteric groups and others, was absolutely necessary when people were healthier, especially psychologically and spiritually, so that it would have been very dangerous to tell medieval people, or people in the Victorian era, people in the early 20th century, that it was a lot more than Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in the JFK assassination, that Son of Sam was not alone, that Ted Kaczynski was actually part of an FBI setup, and the FBI is implicated in the Unabomber crimes. You couldn't do that in those days because the entire government, the whole foundation of the system would have been shaken by people absolutely enraged, and leaders would have come forth to channel that rage into positive aspects. Whereas now, no, we are seeing that as a result of the processing I'm talking about, the psychic processing, the consumption of the knowledge and branding of twilight language. It's an act of enthrallment. It's not liberating because of where our humanity is now fading. You know, people say knowledge is power. It's not. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge can be distracting. And I find most people can concentrate on one article or one video, and then they're on to the next aspect, and they end up very fragmented in terms of how they deal with these things. It becomes more entertainment, enlightenment. But what is power? Ability to detect fraud. That's power. And we need to retrain ourselves in how to do that. And a great deal of that involves concentration and separating ourselves from this group mind videodrome, this carnival, a digital carnival sideshow, which is going on in America. The internet is part of it. Television is part of it. Certainly video games and the forthcoming meta world or virtual reality is part of it, is part of eroding our humanity and our ability to react in a truly human fashion in terms of justice and corruption in government and so forth. And so revelation of the method is a key concept in understanding that, for example, in my book, Twilight Language, I'm somewhat skeptical about what the reaction will be to the book in terms of what people are going to do with it. Does this empower them to proceed with demands for justice? Are we ever going to prosecute? The only conspirator, to my knowledge, at a very high level of conspiracies in America that was put on trial was Clay Shaw by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. And Shaw was a CIA asset. He perjured himself on the stand and said that he was not. And then later on, it was determined that, yes, he had worked for the CIA in the 1950s and certainly was still connected to them during the Kennedy assassination. And so where are the prosecutions of these perpetrators? And so when you have people committing these crimes, whether it's Oklahoma City or 9/11, connected to the United States government and the cryptocracy, they're never caught. There's never a price to pay. In fact, in some ways, the revelation of their crimes powers up the cryptocracy through this concept of revelation of the method. They're going to continue to be able to recruit and to have around them a mantle of both inevitabilism and invulnerability. And that is a very powerful, magical concept to induce whole populations with. It is inevitable that we project our concept of the future onto your minds. And an inevitable future leads people to feel that any other alternative is therefore of no consequence, and they defeat themselves before they even enter the field of battle.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the reasons why I invited you into the discussion, Mr. Hoffman, because unlike other people who write in this area, in this field, I am beginning to see, and this has been troubling me for quite some time, that people in the so-called independent research community or conspiracy theory, they become part of the problem. They're a giant distraction. It's this knowingness, this smug knowing, oh, we know. And like you say, they think knowing is doing, and that knowing is knowledge is power. That's the beginning of action. But at the same time, Mr. Hoffman, what's going on right now in the British Commonwealth of Canada is a seemingly spontaneous uprising. Unless that itself is orchestrated, we can never rule that out. But you know, as part of the epistemology, this image, this central image of the Gordian knot. How do you cut the Gordian knot? And it can be done ritualistically. And what can we do to move to that point of cutting the Gordian knot? I think it's beginning to, the knot is fraying. It might not be a clean cut, but I think it's beginning to fray. It's weakening. The fibers are weakening. And I know that you're not very optimistic about it, because I was rereading your preface and introduction in preparation for this talk. Are you still of the mind that perhaps we're just seeing this conspiracy theory and these investigations as just sort of a distraction in itself? Or are you more optimistic these days?
Well, you put your finger on it, that it is a distraction. It is part of the problem. But I'm personally optimistic at a networking level locally.
Okay.
Just as Macrobiotics said, and they were among the very first to say, eat locally. If you live in Alaska, you do have to eat animal food. If you live in the tropics, you should never have it. And that was one of their insights. So locally, here in North Idaho, I'm a member of a church where out of a congregation of 350, we had 20 babies born last year. We've had lots of marriages. The people are conservative. They put forth family values. And so that's the source of my optimism on that foundation, which to me, only the foundation of life can possibly be a basis for optimism rather than at the level of phenomena and epistemology. That's another matter entirely where I am highly skeptical based on the facts only. I'm not oriented to sin against the virtue of hope. That would be wrong. But at the same time, to be naive or gullible is also an error. I think that you're right that as far as I know, and again, we never are absolutely certain, but what the Canadian truckers did seems to be a spontaneous eruption of a populist sentiment that we are ruled by very corrupt dictators, and something has to be done about that. And so that to me is highly interesting, is just whether or not a Pied Piper like a Donald Trump is going to come along and then channel that into some destructive purposes. And I by no means believe that everything Donald Trump did was destructive, but I, for example, on his Supreme Court picks. But on the other hand, I agree with Ann Coulter that this is a shallow, lazy ignoramus, to quote her verbatim, who was in the White House. And then, of course, his last days there and what he did on January 6th puts paid to his heritage and legacy. But how do we cut the Gordian knot? It's being rooted, and it's having roots. You know, a tomato plant, it grows very quickly. You can pull it out with your thumb. The burdock plant, which I don't know if you're one of them, but my Japanese American friends were very fond of burdock. It's almost impossible to uproot unless you're a very strong person and you work at it. And it takes a long time to grow. Yes, takes a long time to grow. And that's what we need. This is psychological warfare on the part of our adversaries and enemies. And we have to relate to it on the level of our own personal psychology. So I may be stepping on some toes here, but when I look at the state of white people in America, for example, and the rate of their abortions, which is some 40 million since abortion on demand was legalized by the Supreme Court. And what I would say is that if you're killing your own posterity at that level, you probably don't have much of a stake in the future. And it is through our children and our grandchildren, or as the Native Americans said, how does this affect the next 7 generations of our children? And more we're living in an eschatological framework that's been imposed on us, that the end is near, the end of the world, the end of all things, and therefore don't even bother to have children. Well, when you're at that level of suicidal pessimism, you really have brought the death culture on yourself, because the people who are environmentalists, for example, should be having the most children, because they'll be the ones who are raising each one of those children up to be ambassadors of ecology. But this is lost to them. A great deal of common sense is lost in these days. And so cutting the Gordian knot, I think, is much less complex. And there's a simpler method to it, and that is to return to how life was led by traditional peasant people of the past in terms of the kind of universal virtue that we can find in terms of how they valued their families, the land, and locality. And if we return to that while we're researching, but while we also take a fast from the internet, and myself, I hope that I never put on a pair of virtual reality glasses, but the more we can take a break from the group mind, the hive mind that exists inside the internet, on television, in the video games, and so forth, the more we can begin to take back some of our humanity. And this is fundamentally what it is. It's an attack on our humanity. It's the bestialization of people. I reverse evolution. I believe we started out as angels and we're decaying into a simian type of existence, even while we consider ourselves the crown of creation because of our technology. But I think we've proven that very advanced powers over technology are not necessarily demonstrative of wisdom. And what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki is certainly proof of that. Very intelligent men designed those bombs, and look at how they used them.
Wow, an incredible analogy drawn from actually existing history of what we're facing now, which is now what self-annihilation, I guess, would be appropriate, not at the kinetic level anymore, though, but at the genetic level, right? mRNA and related technologies. Now, I know your time is at a premium, Mr. Hoffman. So did you want to finish up with the Chipango book, or you want to talk about Japanese history or philosophy, or did you already cover that?
No, I did not write this book that you found. There's a man named Michael A. Hoffman who wrote Egypt Before the Pharaohs. He's deceased. It's a good book, and I wish I had written it, but I didn't.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm glad you clarified that.
Him. But I haven't written a book on Japanese history, although I must say that the only two nations that have ever translated my work into a foreign language, in France, one of my book appears in French translation, and two of my books appeared in Japan in Japanese language translation. So again, I feel very close to that. That was, by the way, that was the Israeli Holocaust against the Palestinians. And the other one is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. Those were published in Japan.
Incredible. Well, I hope my friends and associates in Japan, and by the way, one side of my family is Hiroshima, the other side is Okinawa. These are the two big ritualistic sites of mass slaughter. So I fully understand it at a very deep as well as intellectual level, your message. And that's why I was so intent on inviting you into this conversation. And I'm very grateful of the work that you've produced. I hope you will further collect, codify, gather your thoughts and your influences. You answered a lot of questions about the influence that Mr. Shelby Downard had on your life, and the fact that as a child you were brought up in the I guess it was still Latin Mass, the traditional Roman Catholic religion, and went to Hobart College. And this further helps me, and I think your audience, understand where all these rich ideas, the whole legacy and the genesis of these insights that you have brought and shared with us. And I'll just leave off, and I know I'm singing your praises relentlessly here, but I'll leave off by saying that I am quite optimistic about where we're going in this society. And it's largely because of intellectuals such as yourself, who have long ago have put yourself out in the firing line, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, and put your ideas out there and put them out to the world, and let the people themselves try to sift through them and make use of them however they can. And I speaking for myself, I've greatly benefited from your insights, and I thank you for your contribution. I'll let you have the last word by telling us how to get your books. And I don't know if you have a newsletter or print media or a social media channel, something like that. But please, Mr. Hoffman, let's have advertisements for you.
I'm very grateful for what your remarks there, Professor. I really am. Appreciate it very much. So our website is revisionisthistory.org. On Twitter, it's at Hoffman Michael A. We do a newsletter. I'm discontinuing it after 124 issues. We've been publishing for more than 25 years because I want to concentrate on my books. I have many more, God willing, that I hope to be able to write, but we'll publish all the way until October of this year. And there are also 117 back issues available. That's called Revisionist History, just like revisionisthistory.org. If they go to the website, they can get most of the information. Mailing address is P.O. Box 849, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho 83816. And that's about all I can think about. I guess I'll conclude with the fact that I think we have enemies on the right as much as on the left. And I've certainly been interested in maybe 70% of what Tucker Carlson has to say, although I wish he'd cut back on the maniacal laughter and the sweeping generalizations. but I was horrified when he does these Tucker Carlson interviews, and you get a little sampling of it on the main show. And he had on the rock star Ted Nugent, who is a notable campaigner for the Second Amendment and the right of everybody to carry a weapon. And in the course of his conversation, Nugent made an astonishingly ignorant and stupid remark. And he said, you know, this is America. I'm paraphrasing here. This is America. And let's face it, you Pearl Harbor us and we Nagasaki you. Now, imagine making an analogy like that. Japanese armed forces attacked a military base. And in return for attacking a military base, we burn alive women and children who have no say in this and no role in it. And by the way, as you probably know, Nagasaki was the principal city of Roman Catholics in Japan. And it's often said that because of cloud cover, the original target had to be abandoned and Nagasaki was chosen. I believe Nagasaki was deliberately targeted because of its large Christian population. And of course, many Buddhists and other people died in that Holocaust. And for Ted to say that without Tucker confronting him is, to me, the core of all of these war crimes. I love America. You heard me praise the founders. The system that started out was flawed, but it was a beacon of liberty. But we also have to face the crimes, including that unsolved, how these criminals have gotten away with the killing of our president at nearly high noon in Dallas, Texas, at a Masonic ritual site. And these things are swept under the rug with this jingoism that the right is now falling into the trap where, well, if the left is against it, we're for it. And that type of thesis antithesis reaction is something that cows do. You know, it's not what human beings should do. I was very disappointed that Tucker didn't call him out and say, look, Ted, you're talking about apples and oranges here. And yet we continue to see in America a justification for the mass murder of civilians if it ends a war quickly, or, you know, whatever the alibi is. And actually, Walter Trohan, when I was a reporter, he was the Chicago Tribune reporter at the time. He was in touch with Admiral Leahy. Admiral Leahy said the Japanese have been trying to surrender since 1943, but it's a conditional surrender. They want the emperor to be sacrosanct and nothing to happen to him. If we can pledge that, we can end the war in 1943, they'll surrender. No, on the altar of unconditional surrender, that's why Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. That's why many US Marines and many Japanese soldiers died after 1943. So Americans, be they conservatives or liberals, I'm neither, I'm an independent. They need to confront this about our past. Let's work on it. Otherwise, we're not going to have a future if we continue to be misled by these Pied Pipers. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Professor Hamamoto. I'm very grateful to you, and I hope we can get together again sometime.
I would like nothing more. Thank you so much, Mr. Hoffman. Ladies and gentlemen, get these books, read them, get the newsletter until it runs out. I'm sure it'll be archived. Mr. Hoffman is one of the most important independent thinkers writing in the English language, and the French and the Japanese people realize that. But we need to get Americans, our fellow Americans, on board as well. And that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation. Yes, please keep us updated on your research. You're welcome back on this program at anytime you like, Mr. Hoffman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening or good morning. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.